Hey everyone, George here and welcome back to the channel. So a few videos ago we talked about a new series that I was going to be starting on tank maintenance. And the reason why I wanted to do this series is because I get a lot of people that ask me questions about how you can kind of lighten the load on tank maintenance and not make it so burdensome and be sort of enslaved to your tanks so much that you just don't enjoy them any longer. It's really the number one reason why people get out of the hobby. So we're going to talk about that today. This is going to be the first part of that three-part series, and in this part we're going to cover three different areas. Number one, water quality, which is absolutely everything to keeping a good quality tank. Number two, we're going to talk about the health of your fish. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how to assess your fish to make sure that they're doing well in your tank, and give you some ideas on how you can keep track of the fish in your tank with just a couple of little things that you might not have even thought about. And then the third thing that we're going to talk about is a good feeding schedule. It's so important that you feed your fish on a schedule, just like us as human beings. We need to be on a certain schedule to make sure that we're eating correctly. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of foods that are important to your fish, because not every food that you have in one can of flakes or something like that is going to cover the whole nutritional value for every fish in your tank. You have fish that are your community fish, you have algae eaters, you have bottom feeders, and that encompasses a lot of different things. But I'm going to teach you a couple of things on how to make sure that all of the fish in your tank are getting the nutrition that they need and putting you on a good schedule that isn't going to make it difficult for you to feed your fish on a daily basis. And we're also going to talk about whether or not you're feeding your fish too much or maybe not feeding them enough. I hope you'll stay with me. We're going to really dig into a couple of really important things here, and I think you're really going to enjoy this series. So stick with me and we'll be right back. So the number one maintenance issue that I hear people talk about all the time is how they hate doing water changes. Well, I got to tell you, that's the most important thing that you can possibly do to your tank to maintain a good quality of water in that tank. Now, it does not have to be something that takes a long time, and you don't have to do large water changes. In fact, I don't recommend you do large water changes. Before we get into this too heavily, I want to talk to you about the kinds of water changes I'm talking about. I am not talking about doing water changes on new tanks. I'm talking about tanks that are well established. Now, this tank here is about 1.5 years old. The fish have been in here for that amount of time. There has been no new fish added to this tank. These fish have all lived together for about 1.5 years. And what I want to tell you is that just because the water looks good does not mean that the water quality is up to standard in it. So it's so important that we do these water changes. Like I said, it's the number one reason why people get out of this hobby, is because they let their tanks go, they don't do the water changes, they get all kinds of problems with algae and other things that make their tank go out of whack and out of balance, and then they just get so frustrated with it they just give up on the hobby. If you can spend 15 minutes a week on each tank that you have, I don't know if you maybe have 1 tank, 2 tanks, 5 tanks, 10 tanks, whatever you have, if you can spend about 15 minutes a week on doing a water change of just 1/4 of your tank. Now, if you look at this tank here, I'm talking about right about to here. If you do that once a week on a well-established tank, now as I said, we're not talking about new tanks here, we're talking about well-established tanks, and you are going to be ahead of the game, and you are not going to have issues like algae, you're not going to have ammonia spikes, and those kinds of things. But of course, there are some other things that factor into this, and we're going to be talking about those in just a few minutes as well. But first of all, let's do a 1/4 water change on this tank. I'm going to go ahead and set up for that and come back to you in just a few minutes. I'm not going to film the whole thing because obviously that would be a waste of time for you to be sitting and watching me do a water change on this. But I can tell you from start to finish, it's roughly 10 to 15 minutes. I literally have it down to about 10 minutes. So stick with me. We're going to do a water change on this, and we're going to show you how it does not have to take a long time, and it does not have to be something that is so difficult that you don't want to do it at least 15 minutes a week, and make sure that this water is in absolute pristine shape. Stick with me and we'll be right back. So as I said, this does not have to be a hugely time-consuming effort, and it does not have to be something that absolutely is something you don't look forward to in nightmares. Now, as you can see, some of the things that I have set up here, I have a couple of different chemicals that I'm going to use with this water change. First of all, Chem makes some great stuff. You don't have to use Chem. You can pretty much use whatever you're comfortable with using or you're used to using. I use Stability and Prime. Stability for larger water changes. We won't be using that today, but I just wanted to bring it out and show it to you. Prime is your water conditioner that's going to be your dechlorinator and also take ammonia out of the water if there is any as you're adding water back into the tank. Now, you basically have, this is a rather large pitcher here. This is over a gallon. And so basically we're going to be taking 3 of these out, which is going to bring this down to about here. And so you're taking roughly 3 gallons out of this tank. Now, this is a 20-gallon tank, but there is not 20 gallons of water in here, obviously, by the time you consider the substrate that's in here, by the time you consider the rocks, the hardscape, the plants, and everything else. You really have less than 20 gallons by far in here. So we're going to be taking 3 of these out of here. This is the hose that we're going to be using to do that, and then this is the other tool that we're going to be using to just go along the edges, along the top and down the sides a little bit. If you do this every single time, you're just not going to have anything that's unsightly or algae that's growing or anything like that. If you have good algae eaters in your tank, you're not going to have any issues with that anyway. Urite snails, those are optional. As I said in another video, those are not snails that are going to live long in your tank, but if you want to try to use them to keep algae down, that's something that's up to you, but I don't find that they live very long. They're really not designed for fresh water to have a long life. So we're going to get started on this, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to unplug the parts of this that I said were important to unplug, and that is your pump and your heater. It's so important that you make sure that the pump and the heater are turned off before you start this water change. And then we're just going to take the lid off, drain out as much as we can off the top of that lid, any condensation. Just sort of set that to the side. I know you can't see some of this off camera here, but basically at this point here, I'm going to look around for anything that is in the area back here that would be considered something that I don't want. Sometimes little leaves and things like that get back in there. And we want to make sure also that we're looking back in this column back here to make sure there are no fish that have jumped over this little barrier at the top here. And we're going to go from there. So now that I have these pump turned off and the heater turned off and I have the lid off it, basically all I'm going to do is stick one end of this tube in here into a corner so that I don't suck fish up in here by accident, because sometimes these fish get a little bit rambunctious and that can be a problem. So all I'm going to do is start a siphon on this, and that's really, it takes sometimes a couple of times to get it done, but we're basically going to start a siphon on this, and it's going to take, like a minute and a half or so for this thing to fill up with water from inside the tank here. Again, you want to kind of keep track of your hose so that smaller fish that might be curious or swimming by are not sucked up into this thing by accident. And pulled into your pitcher. A lot of times they survive that. I've had that happen a couple of times, but it's not something you want to do because typically they get injured and they don't survive. Now we're less than a minute into this, as you can see here, and basically in that minute we are almost full on this gallon pitcher here, and we're pretty much watching the water table drop down to about where I told you we were going to have it come down to, which is about right here. So it's going to take 3 of these. Now I'm going to pull this hose out of here because we have basically a pitcher of water that we have removed at this point here. I'm not going to show you the other 2 pitchers that I'm taking out of here because, like I said, that's just a waste of time. You don't need to see that. But we'll get back to adding the water back in just a second here. So a couple of tips and tricks that I want to tell you about before we get into this too far is, as I have gone ahead and got some new water here, and we're going to go ahead and add some of this conditioner in here. Now this is Prime. As I said, it's a great conditioner because it also has some components in here that keep ammonia down and other things. So it's not just a dechlorinator. It actually has some beneficial things in here, but this stuff does not smell good, man. I'm telling you, it is like rotten eggs. So that's just something that's normal, and it's not a big deal. You don't have to use Prime. You can use whatever you like to use and are used to using, and that's fine. I mean, it doesn't really matter what product you use as long as you are using a good dechlorinator. And stability we're not going to use because I haven't done a 50% water change. I've barely done a quarter of a water change in here, so it's really not necessary. But we're going to take this. One of the things I wanted to mention on how to make sure that you don't have to go back and regulate your water every time is, wherever you're getting your water from, whatever sink you're getting it out of or whatever, make a little mark where the heat is. Heat the water all the way up on the hottest and then bring that over to that notch, and it'll be exactly the temperature that you have in your tank. All you got to do is take a thermometer and to set that, check the water in your tank, check the water coming out of your faucet. They match each other. It's going to match every single time as long as you haven't changed the heat adjustment on your water tank. So we're going to take this, and basically you read the instructions on the back. It's just barely, just a little bit of water, or a little bit of Prime, I mean, for the water. You don't need a lot. And I just dip the cap in there just to get it rinsed off. And you're going to do this for each pitcher that you add. Now we took 3 pitchers out. We're going to add 3 pitchers plus and maybe another quarter of a pitcher back in, because there has to be some accountability for the amount of evaporation that may have taken place. But before we do that, we're going to go in here with a toothbrush and we're going to scrub along these edges a little bit, up and down this area here, and along the seams, across the top. On the other side here, we're going to get the front of the glass with the toothbrush here. We don't want to do too much because there are some very beneficial things in here for your snails to eat, and for your autocinclids and algae eaters to eat as well. Scrub this little area where you have water coming in. Take a look in the back, make sure there's no fish back there. Somehow they do. Fish do get back into the back chambers here sometimes, and so you have to check for that, whenever you're doing a water change, because they sometimes can surprise you and just show up back there. But we're going to talk about how to count your fish and make sure that you know where they are at all times in a minute here. Some little tricks to doing that. So basically I've done as much cleaning as I need to do, and we're going to start adding this water back in here. Now, taking the water out, I counted the minutes that it took for me to remove the 3 pitchers of water that I took out of here, and basically it was about 5 minutes. So adding it back in is a little bit more time consuming, just because you can't pour really fast, otherwise you disturb the substrate at the bottom. So I'm just going to go ahead and pour this one back in here. And as it's filling up, you can pour a little bit faster. You just want to make sure you're not disturbing, like I said, a ton of the substrate in the bottom. Now, once a month, or once every 2 months probably, depending on the size of the tank, I do add a siphon with a larger bottom on it and go through and siphon the gravel out. But that would be on your 50% water changes, where you're going to use the stability to add in there, to add in some nutrients and things to the water that you may have removed on that 50% water change, to keep your beneficial bacteria to the level where it needs to be, and that sort of thing. So we're almost done putting this back in here. We're going to do 2 more after this, and like I said, a little bit more than that, maybe another quarter of a pitcher, just to account for the evaporation. But that's really basically it. Now I keep another towel on hand, as you can see, and what I do is I wipe the lip of this on the outside and on the inside all the way around, just to make sure that everything is nice and clean, and takes a second to do that. So when I come back, we're going to be talking a little bit more about how to assess the health of your fish, and we're going to do that by a couple of tips and tricks that I know that have made that so much easier for me to make sure that I know that my fish are doing well in my tank. And also, if you're kind of concerned about the count of your fish, maybe you think a fish is missing or something like that, there's a really cool trick to make sure that you can count those fish and make sure that that fish is there or not there. And if they're not there, then they've either been eaten by the other fish, if they've died. Typically you'll find dead fish in your tank. They don't usually stay at the bottom. They usually float to the top, unless they've gotten into a crack or something like that and they just weren't able to get back out. And that does happen. But anyways, when we come back, we're going to be talking about fish health and how you can do a couple of things to make sure your fish are really healthy. We're going to get right to that in just a second here. So one of the things I didn't mention before we were done with that water change is something that I forgot to tell you, and that is to make sure that you do plug in your pump and your heater. Not that it's going to be a huge problem, and hopefully you won't forget for a long period of time, but just get into a habit of making sure you plug that pump and that heater back in. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but it was just something I thought about, and I thought, well, I better tell them that, because you can do that. I've done it before. So the next thing we're going to talk about is assessing the health of your fish. One of the things that I do every single day is I come in and I look at all of my tanks after the lights have been on roughly an hour or so. And basically that gives the fish time to get awake and to be active in the tank, and gives you an opportunity to look at your fish. Now, I hate to say it, but one of the things that I do first is look at the most expensive fish that I have in my tanks, and that would be my cichlids, my killifish, my pistos, and things like that that cost a lot of money. And I look at those fish and I really do a quick assessment basically on their health. If they're swimming around and acting normal and whatever, I don't worry about anything that's going on with them. And I know by keeping a little bit of a card with what's in the tank, I know what's in there, but I always know my more expensive fish by heart anyway, just simply because that's our nature to do that. Now, one of the things I would tell you is if you do have a fish that's acting funny and is not behaving correctly, the thing that you want to do is kind of watch that fish over a day or two, because fish can act weird for a day or so and then be totally normal within a day or two, and there's nothing wrong with them. But if they're acting weird, they're off in a corner, or they're being picked on by another fish, you know, it's kind of weird. You can have fish that are in with each other for a long period of time, but as they mature, they can start getting territorial and things can start to happen. Look for ripped fins or fish that are being aggressive with other fish and so forth. It only takes you a minute to really look at these things. You know your tank well enough to know what's going on with the fish inside that tank. If they're acting funny, you know, it's something you should pay attention to. If this goes on for more than a day or two, you might want to isolate that fish into a hospital tank that you should have set up already alongside your quarantine tank. And as I said, you know, maybe isolate that fish and make sure that there is no issues with that fish that are going to cause problems for the rest of your tank. It's very rare that it happens, but it does happen. I mean, they're fish, they get sick just like we do. I mean, we get sick and we don't feel good for a day or two, and you know, we are usually fine. But if something is seriously wrong, that fish is going to act that way for a while, and you want to make sure you get that out of there. Now, one of the things that people ask me about is how do you keep track of the tetras, for example, in your tank. We're going to talk about this tank in particular just because it's easy for me to look at the camera and talk to you about the fish that are in here. Now, I know that I have 7 red-eye tetras in this tank. What I like to do is let the light come on, like I said, for about an hour in the morning and not feed these fish, because if you feed the fish, you're not coaching them to the front of the tank. They're going to be wandering all over because they're not hungry. Take out a cell phone and very quickly, I have someone else's phone here, but anyways, very quickly take and put it on the camera mode and record slow-mo. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to stand back and I'm going to take a slow motion picture of this tank if I think that there's something going on. I'm not going to do this every single day, but if I think that there's something going on with the tank where there might be some fish missing or whatever, I'm going to take a slow motion video, and that's all I'm going to do is about less than 30 seconds. And then when I get a chance, I'm going to play it back and I'm going to count the fish that are in there to see if anyone's missing or whatever. It's a very quick way and a cool trick to use to make sure that fish in your tank are front and center and accounted for, because a lot of times they can go missing and we don't even know it. So play that video back later on. It's just a really cool trick that you can use to make sure. I used to just take a picture and then, you know, kind of blow it up with my fingers or whatever and count the fish. But the slow-mo tip was something somebody gave me a while back, and it really does work well because the fish are constantly moving around, and it gives you an opportunity in slow motion to watch those fish and to really get an accountability of them. So really, as far as fish health goes, that's really all you need to be looking for. If fish are dying in your tank, and you got to check your water parameters because something's off. But if you're doing regular water changes and nothing has influenced your fish as far as putting new fish in there or whatever, always have an isolation tank or a quarantine tank for new fish. Do not add them directly into your tank. It's a really bad idea. I did it when I first started in this hobby and I regretted it, because you're oftentimes going to add diseases into a tank that are just going to give you a lot of heartache. Put them in a quarantine tank, add them to your whatever tank you're going to put them in down the road after you've assessed them for 7 to 10 days. And you don't need to have a fully planted substrate tank or whatever. Just a bigger tank, maybe a 10-gallon or something like that, that has a good air stone in it and a good heater. And you know, your fish will do fine in there until you add them to your community tank. Just make sure you're feeding them and keeping an eye on their health, making sure they don't have ick and whatever. So, you know, treat them just like you would your other tanks, and check on them daily as well. Now, we're going to get into feeding in a minute here, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about that a little bit, because it's so important that we get on a good schedule of feeding, but it's also important that we make sure that when we're feeding our fish, that we're feeding them a variety of foods that are keeping our fish healthy. When we come back, we're going to talk about that in just a minute here. So the last thing I want to cover today is feeding, and it's really important that you understand the health and benefits of having good quality food at your disposal to feed your fish. Have a variety of foods just like you would have for yourself that keep your fish healthy, colored up, and active. It's so important to the longevity of these fish and their long-term health, that we do make sure that we have a variety of foods. As you can see here, I put out some of these foods that I think are important, that are good quality foods and healthy for your fish. I'll go through them a little bit. This one here is a pellet that basically goes directly to the bottom of your tank. On the way down, some of your larger fish are going to get these, but this also ensures that your cories and other types of fish are getting good nutrition as well. So the second one is a good quality food that is either a flake or a pellet. This happens to be pellets. I like pellets a lot. I'm not real big on flake foods, but I do use them occasionally. But this is a really high quality pellet food that is going to just sort of work its way through the tank. It's very light, so it's going to move through the tank like a flake would. It's not going to stay at the top though, so it's going to get into that center column where it's a smaller pellet that your tetras and your mid-level tank fish are going to get a good source of food. Now this one here has omega-3s in it, which are very good for your fish as far as color goes. Very healthy for their organs and other parts of the body that really rely on good nutrition for them to be very active and very colorful. Now the last thing that I like to do is make sure that I put in their diet some things that are natural, and this is bug bites. This is something that most of you probably know. It is a Canadian food company for your fish, but it's widely available at most stores. It's a little more expensive, and like I said, spend a little money, because in the long term your fish are going to be healthier and happier, and so are you, because your fish are going to live a long time. But Bug Bites is great because it has parts of bugs and insects in there that they would get in the wild. It's very natural for them, so I like using this stuff. Now the last thing I want to talk about is your bottom feeders and your algae eaters. They need a source of food as well. Now what I like to do is, after about 3 hours after the lights go out, is to go around and take one of the wafers out of here, and one wafer will pretty much do about 3 tanks. And as you can see, these wafers are pretty good size. They're thin, and what I do is I break it up into pieces and I drop it into the tank at dark. In other words, after the lights have been out for about 3 hours. And the reason I do that is so that the other fish in the tank aren't competing for this food that goes directly to the bottom, where your cories will get it. It's full of protein. Cories like algae and protein. A lot of people don't even know that, but it's true. Your cories, your plecos, your shrimp, and your algae eaters, such as your Siamese algae eaters, your autocinclus, any of those kinds of fish are going to benefit by these, and they're not going to be fighting and competing with other fish for them if you put this in there after dark. Just a great tip for you to make sure that all of your fish are getting the nutrition that they need. Now the last thing I would talk about are frozen foods. I do have a variety of frozen foods that I only feed like once a week as a treat. I have bloodworms, I have Daphne, I have a couple of different kinds of things that I use, but it's really important that every once in a while they get some kind of food like that that is a little bit more natural and has a lot of protein in it and is good for them. Stuff that they would get more in the wild than, as I said, you don't have to do it a lot, just use it as a treat. But I really think that a variety of foods is so important for your fish. Now, I feed my fish 1 time a day. That's a little controversial with some people that I talk to, but as you can see, my fish are healthy. And I feed them a variety of foods. Now, what I will typically do is I will switch up these foods every other day to a couple of different ones in there, and I feed them once a day, and I don't feed them a ton. I feed them a portion that they can eat within 3 to 5 minutes. They don't need anything more than that. They really don't. In fact, your fish could go a whole week and not really suffer tremendous consequences from not eating. But we don't want to do that, obviously, but I'm just telling you that these fish are a lot more resilient and need a lot less food than you think they do. You're just polluting your tank by putting a lot of extra food in there anyway. So why bother wasting the food and putting it in the tank and it doesn't get fully consumed and it just pollutes your tank or contaminates your tank. So I feed once a day. If you want to feed a couple of times a day, I don't have any problem with that. But make sure you are doing those water changes on a regular basis, and that's going to be the important thing if you're going to feed more than once a day. Thank you for joining me today. I hope some of these tips and tricks and maintenance ideas have helped you to get some idea on how to take care of these fish, to keep them healthy, to keep your water column healthy, and also to make sure that your fish are being looked at and cared for, and you know that they're healthy by looking at their behaviors and all of those things that we covered. So the next part of this series is going to be a little bit more in depth about doing 50% water change and vacuuming your substrate or sand or whatever you might have. This isn't just sand. The front is, but as you go back, there is substrate in there for the plants and that sort of thing. You really have to have that in there for good filtration. This is just really a facade down here of sand. But we're going to talk about vacuuming your substrate a little bit so that you make sure that you're getting some of the heavier stuff out of the bottom of your tank at least once a month. It doesn't take real long. I don't do the 3 or 4 tanks at a time because it can be really time consuming to do that. I do a couple a day at the end of the month until I'm done with all of my tanks. The second thing that we're going to talk about is cleaning the glass on the inside once a month thoroughly, and we'll talk about some tools that you can use to really scrub that off. You don't want to do it too much because there's a lot of sources of food on there for your snails, for your autocinclus and fish like that benefit from having a little bit of that slime on the glass that you can't even really see. It does start to build up. That's why you got to clean it once a month and make sure that you're taking care of that. And then the last thing we're going to talk about in the next series is taking and trimming your plants and using those trimmings either in other tanks or right back into the tank that you have. If you have one that's full like this, obviously you don't need any more plants in there. Use them in another tank that maybe you feel they're deficient in plants, because plants are a filter. They're a natural filter, and it's so important that you get those tanks heavily planted as much as you possibly can. And if you're getting the cuttings out of one tank, put them in another tank that can use some of those cuttings, because your tank will benefit by having those. Thank you again. Leave a comment down below if you didn't like something I said or disagreed with something I said, or if you have a question. Leave it there and I will make sure I get back to you. Anybody that knows me knows that I do get back to people. Also hit that like button. I really appreciate that. And watch the full video, because there's no point in starting one of these videos if you're not going to watch it all the way through, because you're just not going to get all the information that you need. And then the last thing I would ask is that you subscribe. Subscribing is really important. I don't make a living off this. I'm not trying to make a living off this. I'm trying to do a good job at it. It's just like anything else in life. You want to make sure you're doing a good job at putting out a good quality video, and I like to do that. Also, hit that bell at the top. Any new information that I have coming out or videos that are coming out, you're going to be alerted to that. And you're going to know when we have new content coming out all the time, and I really appreciate that. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you learned a little something from all this. And I think there were some great tips and tricks here on, the health of your fish, the feeding of your fish, and water changes and so forth. And like I said, this next series we're going to hit on a whole bunch of new things. Until then, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you on the next one.